Welcome back to A Few Acres of Snow. I'm Tristan, and today we're going to be focusing on the Quebec sovereignty movement and why so many Quebecers want out of Canada. Today I want to focus on the British Conquest and how the colonial administration transformed and in many ways held back the culture of Quebec. This is actually part 2 of a 3-part series, so if you haven't seen part 1 yet, I'd recommend taking a look at that video before moving on. The mere mention of La Conquête, the conquest, is immediately understood to most Quebecers as referring to the British conquest of New France toward the end of the 18th century. And whether you are a federalist or a sovereigntist, see my last video for the distinction between those two terms, the event is to a great extent the traumatic moment in the Quebecois cultural imagination, and the event which brought us to the current political situation. Their lands prior to the conquest extended from modern-day Quebec City down through southern Ontario, along the full length of the Mississippi River, and all the way up to the great city of New Orleans. The names of many important US cities like Detroit or Détroit stand to remind us still of their origin as French outposts. After the conquest, all the potential for some great North American French state were snuffed out, or at least that's one way to look at it. As you may know from my previous video, it's not at all clear what the French would have done, if anything, with New France if the British hadn't conquered it. Just as with Britain's colonial holdings, New France was just material in a global chess game played by all of the European powers, and material which France was clearly more than willing to exchange. Regardless, the passing of New France into the hands of the British is not made in some sense more palatable to Quebecers because of French negligence. In fact, it's made all the more tragic. The colonists of New France enjoyed a measure of freedom when they were being ignored. This would not be the case under the British. Starting right after the 7 Years' War, the conflict which led to the conquest of New France, the British began their messy project of trying to control the colony with the Royal Proclamation of 1763. As a side note, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 is actually a really important document for Canada in general. It's the first mention of First Nations in Canadian law. It also represents, for many Indigenous people today, the first of many promises that would be broken. Regardless, as far as the French Canadians were concerned, it was the means by which they would be shut out of government, and their religion, it seemed at first, would be choked out of existence. As a Protestant country, the British were deeply distrustful of Catholics. It was illegal for a Catholic to hold office in Britain proper, and so the same laws would obtain in the colony. This was achieved through the Oath of Testament, which required anyone who wanted to hold public office to swear allegiance above all to the British monarch, to the head of the Protestant Church of England. The implications of this are made clear if we consider that the British, being a more democratically minded people than the French, also wanted to establish a popular assembly. The idea here being that settlers could participate, if in a limited way, in their own governance. However, you can't hold public office if you don't swear the Oath of Testament, and so Catholics are effectively barred from participation in the National Assembly. In effect, this is democracy, sort of, for Protestants only, but you could always convert. As for the Catholic Church itself, the British took a bit more of a passive approach. The plan would be to permit the existence of Catholic churches within the colony, but to refuse entry to appointees from Rome. The goal was for French Canadians to be unable to replace their churchmen, and so within about a generation or so, no more Catholicism. Also, the goal was to build as many Protestant schools as possible across the colony in order to ease the passage from Catholic barbarity to Protestant civilization. Lastly, the province would be renamed. New France was dead, and the province of Quebec was born. As a side note, if you could hit the like button and subscribe, I would be eternally grateful. It really helps the channel and helps me teach more people about Canadian history. Now, while this policy of assimilation seems pretty cut and dry, it was also very clear to the first British governors that it was absolutely destined for failure. James Murray and then Guy Carleton arrived in Quebec and realized the immediate impossibility of the demographic situation. There were simply more French Canadians than there were British. Any attempt to make that large population look like the smaller population was going to be impossible. They also realized that attempting to assimilate the locals might just aggravate them. And after an extremely costly war, the British had zero interest whatsoever in fomenting a rebellion. And so, the policy of compromise became the official policy of the British Crown. On the surface, this policy probably seems like a pretty good thing. Essentially, the idea is that a degree of tolerance would prevail. In 1774, the British would pass the Quebec Act, which, among other things, would replace the Oath of Testament with the Oath of Testament Light. Catholics wouldn't be required to say anything counter to their faith while swearing allegiance to the British monarch. Also, the church would be officially and completely permitted in the province of Quebec. However, if we look a little deeper, we can see that all is not as it seems. The policy of compromise was a means of downsourcing the governance of the colony, in a pattern of governance that colonial powers just seem to really love. The British realized very quickly that their best allies in pacifying the colony were not the people of Quebec, but the elites and the Catholic Church. A good example of this is the fate of the promised elected assembly. Guy Carleton, the chief architect of the Quebec Act, was warned by those in Quebec society he described as the better part, that having an elected assembly of the people would only serve to excite misconduct among the people. In other words, put us on the top and we'll keep the rest of Quebec society on the bottom. In this sense, the Quebec Act enshrined the existing social structures and laws which existed before the conquest, and set the stage for the joint dominance of the medieval seigneurial system and the Catholic Church well into the 20th century. And in fact, in terms of religion, the consequences for Quebec could not have been more dire. In the intervening years, a strange cocktail of repression and permission created in Quebec one of the most conservative iterations of Catholicism the world would ever see. On the one hand, simply being Catholic felt to many Quebecers like a form of resistance to the Protestant conqueror. At the same time, the British colonial administration and the Catholic Church were increasingly becoming just two sides of the same coin. And it was this relationship between the church and state which would dominate Quebec well into the 20th century. There's probably no better example than Confederation itself, the birth of Canada. Confederation was official policy of the Catholic Church. On Sundays in the run-up to Confederation, good Catholic French Canadians could hear from the pulpit that it was God's will that Confederation proceed. Anyways, there's so much that happened between the Conquest and Confederation that I'd like to get into here. For example, the rebellions of 1837 are one of the most thrilling episodes of Canadian history. We just don't have enough time. And so I'd like to make the final point about the relationship between the British colonial administration and the province of Quebec. At its core, the British Empire absolutely did care more about Canada than did the French Empire. At the same time, empires always want to do things on the cheap when they can. And so the Catholic Church, combined with the existing social structures, were the perfect candidates for ensuring control in the colony. The Americans actually thought that the relationship between Britain and New France was so autocratic that they named the Quebec Act as one of the intolerable acts. Those laws, which they saw as a justification for their revolution. Now you might argue that the British were only picking up what the French put down. You can't exactly blame the British for Catholicism and the political system of New France, can you? But remember, our purpose here is to understand how sovereigntists see their relationship with Canada. And the relationship between Quebec and the British Empire is a big part of that. New France, as the province of Quebec, was a society frozen in time, with its worst aspects exaggerated. If it wasn't until after Confederation that the Quebecois people were able to change that status quo, can we really say that they entered Confederation by their own volition? In the words of one of the 20th century's most ardent federalists, Pierre Trudeau, during several generations, the stability of the Canadian consensus was due to Quebec's inability to do anything about it. Ottawa took advantage of Quebec's backwardness to centralize. And because of its backwardness, that province was unable to do anything about it.